On a quiet November morning in 2020, in the peaceful desert town of Farmington, New Mexico, a call pierced the calm. It came from a woman whose voice trembled with what sounded like despair, a woman who claimed she had just found her husband dead on the bedroom floor. That woman was Heather Hoofer, a third-grade teacher and newlywed who had only recently exchanged vows with her husband, Robert. Her call to 911 was filled with panic, confusion, and shock. She said he wasn't breathing, that he was cold, that he was gone. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic and sudden death, a grieving wife discovering her partner lifeless in the sanctity of their shared home. But as investigators arrived and began to examine the scene, a darker truth began to emerge. The blood around Robert's body told a story of violence. The missing knife from the kitchen, the clean surfaces, and the strange calm in Heather's voice didn't align with her account of events. Something didn't sit right. The death that initially appeared accidental or self-inflicted slowly unraveled into a calculated crime, hidden behind layers of composure and time. What began as a tragedy became a mystery, and what looked like a grieving widow began to resemble something far more sinister. It would take 5 long years during which Heather continued to live in the same community, teach young children, and carry the image of a bereaved spouse, before the truth began to fully surface. When police finally arrested her in April 2025, it shook the small town to its core. The woman so many knew as a kind educator, a smiling face at school functions, was now accused of one of the most intimate and cold-blooded acts imaginable, the murder of her husband. This is not just a story about a murder. It's a story about a facade maintained with eerie precision, about evidence carefully obscured, and about a justice system quietly, patiently building its case over time. It's about the questions that linger in the wake of betrayal. How could someone carry on so normally after? To the outside world, Heather and Robert Hoofer looked like a picture of domestic bliss. They had only recently tied the knot, just months before tragedy struck, and their lives appeared to be taking shape in all the ways newlyweds hope for. Heather was a third-grade teacher, deeply embedded in her community. She was known among her peers as nurturing, patient, and endlessly enthusiastic about her students. Her social media painted the image of a cheerful, well-adjusted woman, often sharing posts about lesson plans, cute classroom moments, and smiling selfies with her husband, Robert. Robert Hoofer was quieter by nature. A technician with a reputation for being dependable and hardworking, he was not one to seek attention. Friends described him as humble, kind, and fiercely loyal. He rarely spoke ill of anyone and seemed genuinely content to support Heather's ambitions. The two were often seen together at local restaurants or community events, holding hands, laughing quietly, looking like any other couple navigating the early stages of married life. But behind the smiles and social media filters, their marriage was fraying at the edges. Those close to the couple would later reveal that Heather and Robert's relationship had begun to show signs of strain not long after their wedding. The excitement of marriage quickly gave way to the realities of shared bills, conflicting priorities, and emotional distance. While Heather remained the public face of cheerfulness, privately she seemed irritable and withdrawn. Some friends noticed that she began spending more time apart from Robert, often making excuses to avoid going home after work. Arguments, particularly about money, became a regular occurrence. Robert's modest income as a technician was steady, but it didn't support the lifestyle Heather seemed to want. She occasionally hinted at frustrations with their financial limitations, suggesting she had expected a more upwardly mobile future. Friends noticed she became increasingly preoccupied with appearances, new clothes, social status, and maintaining the image of a perfect life, even if it meant stretching the truth. A former coworker of Heather's, who asked to remain anonymous, recalled a conversation in which Heather expressed doubts about her marriage. She said it felt like she had made a mistake, that she rushed into it. But then she'd laugh it off like it was nothing. These offhand remarks were often masked with sarcasm or jokes, but with hindsight, they now seem far more revealing. There were also subtle, yet telling, signs of control. Robert, who once had an active social circle, began declining invitations to hang out with friends. One former colleague noted that he seemed increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to his death. He stopped showing up to the guys' nights, When we asked, he'd just say he had things to do at home, or that Heather needed him for something. It was like he slowly disappeared. Despite these red flags, no one suspected that their marital discord could escalate into something deadly. After all, couples argue. Newlyweds struggle. Everyone assumed they'd find their rhythm eventually. No one imagined that behind their closed doors, something darker might be brewing, something fatal. In hindsight, it was clear. Heather and Robert were two people living very different emotional experiences within the same marriage. She was restless, increasingly detached, and possibly resentful. He was devoted, perhaps even to a fault, trying to keep the peace and preserve the relationship. And in that emotional disconnect, the seeds of tragedy were quietly being sown. What makes this case all the more chilling is how seamlessly Heather maintained the illusion. Her public persona never wavered. Even as their private life crumbled, she smiled for the camera, celebrated holidays online, and continued teaching with unwavering cheer. The mask never slipped, at least not in ways most people could see. But behind that curated life was a growing storm, and on a cold morning in November 2020, it would finally erupt. It was just after sunrise on the chilly morning of November 10, 2020, when the San Juan County Emergency Dispatch Center in Farmington, New Mexico, received a 911 call that would mark the beginning of one of the most unsettling murder investigations the region had seen in years. The caller was Heather Hoofer. Her voice cracked as she spoke, though it carried a strange steadiness, a control that didn't sit right with dispatchers. Through shallow breaths and what sounded like feigned sobs, she described finding her husband Robert unresponsive on their bedroom floor. "I think he's gone," Heather told the 911 operator. He's just lying there. There's blood." Her description of the scene was clinical, almost rehearsed. When the dispatcher instructed her to begin CPR, her response was chilling in its simplicity. "No, it's too late. He's cold. I think he's already dead," she said, in a tone more resigned than panicked. For experienced dispatchers and, later, responding officers, something felt off almost immediately. The lack of urgency in her voice. The calmness. The almost sterile way she delivered the news of her husband's death. It wasn't what they expected from someone who had supposedly just stumbled across a horrific scene. Within minutes, Farmington police and EMS units arrived at the small, one-story house on the outskirts of town. What they found was disturbing. Robert Hoofer lay on the floor beside the bed in the master bedroom. A large pool of blood surrounded him, having seeped into the carpet and soaked through the bedding. His shirt had been pulled slightly upwards, exposing a deep stab wound to his chest. Blood spatter on the wall and mattress suggested the wound had been inflicted while he was either lying down or in the process of rising, likely caught off guard. There were no signs of life. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Officers began their initial walkthrough, carefully noting the layout of the room and the positioning of the body. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no pried doors. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing appeared ransacked. The home was clean, almost too clean, and eerily quiet. The knife used in the attack was not immediately visible. When officers asked Heather where it was, she shrugged, saying she had no idea. But something about the scene felt staged. There were traces of blood on the doorframe leading into the bedroom. Subtle, nearly wiped clean. A throw rug was slightly damp and had been rearranged, perhaps to cover stains. There were also inconsistencies in Heather's initial account. She claimed she had woken up and found Robert on the floor, but the way the bed was made up suggested no one had slept in it the night before. It looked almost untouched. Detectives began recording Heather's statement on the spot. She recounted the events in a manner that was, once again, strangely devoid of emotion. She said she had gone to sleep on the couch after a small disagreement the night before. When she woke up that morning, she said she went to the bedroom to check on Robert, and that's when she found him. Investigators asked whether she had heard anything unusual during the night. Heather hesitated. "No, I sleep pretty hard," she responded. It was an odd detail, considering she claimed to have gone to bed angry just a few feet away from the room where her husband was murdered. One responding officer, who later spoke under condition of anonymity, said that Heather's effect felt off from the moment they arrived. She wasn't hysterical, she wasn't in shock, she was just talking, like she was ordering coffee or something, the officer said. I've seen people in shock. This wasn't that. They also noticed Heather didn't ask many questions. She never once demanded to know what happened. She didn't plead for them to catch whoever had done it. In fact, she didn't express any concern for her own safety. For a woman who had allegedly found her husband murdered in their own home, she seemed oddly unbothered by the idea that someone dangerous might still be out there. These early impressions would linger in the minds of investigators as the case unfolded. The autopsy, conducted days later, confirmed what officers already suspected. Robert had died from a single, fatal stab wound that pierced his heart. The nature of the wound suggested a downward angle of attack, possibly delivered from above while the victim was seated or lying down. There were no defensive wounds, no signs that Robert had fought back. This detail stood out. Robert was a strong man, 6 feet tall, in good health. Had he been awake or aware of the threat, it was unlikely he would have gone down without a fight. The absence of struggle suggested he was either asleep or had been caught completely off guard. The initial theory of a home invasion was quickly discarded. The house was too intact. There were no footprints, no broken locks, no evidence of anything missing. There was no sign of forced entry, and Robert's wallet, phone, and keys were all still in place. If this had been an intruder, they had taken nothing and left without a trace. As detectives began to piece together the initial evidence, one fact became increasingly clear. Robert's death wasn't random, and it wasn't accidental. It was personal. The nature of the wound, the absence of forced entry, and the behavior of the only other person in the home pointed to one inevitable conclusion: someone close to Robert had killed him. And as the hours passed, suspicion quietly began to circle around Heather Hoofer. What had really happened in that bedroom? Why was Heather so composed? And why, even in the face of her husband's brutal death, did it feel like she was hiding something? Those questions would ignite a 5-year investigation that would eventually pull apart the fabric of a carefully crafted illusion. But in that quiet November morning, all investigators had was a dead man, a single knife wound, and a grieving wife who didn't grieve quite right. Now a chilling tableau of violence and secrets. At first glance, everything appeared eerily calm. The bed was undisturbed, the room neat and orderly. But the silence of the space contrasted starkly with the violent nature of Robert's death. It didn't take long for the investigators to begin piecing together the story told by the blood and the body. Robert's lifeless form lay sprawled on the floor beside the bed. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a gaze that suggested surprise or confusion, as if he had been taken completely off guard. There was no sign of a struggle, no objects displaced in the room, nothing to indicate that Robert had been able to defend himself. The absence of defensive wounds suggested that Robert had not seen his attacker coming, or, more chillingly, that he hadn't had time to react before the fatal blow struck. The blood spatter, however, told a much darker tale. Forensic analysts spent hours studying the intricate patterns left by the blood that had pooled around Robert's body. They determined that the blood splatter patterns indicated the victim had been attacked while lying down, likely asleep in bed, and then either knocked or dragged to the floor. The trajectory of the blood spatter, which formed an angular pattern along the wall and floor, confirmed this. The deep, single-stab wound in Robert's chest, directly over his heart, was consistent with an attack aimed at quickly incapacitating him. The force of the strike was powerful, precise, and deliberate. This was no random act of violence. This was a calculated, lethal assault. In addition to the blood spatter, investigators noted a curious lack of blood elsewhere in the house. No blood stains in the hallway, no trails leading from the bedroom. This suggested that Robert had either bled out quickly or that an effort had been made to clean up the scene. As the detectives continued their search, they began to piece together a more disturbing element of the crime. A knife was missing from the couple's kitchen. The kitchen, only a short distance from the bedroom, was a small, typical home space, and it didn't take long for investigators to note that one of the knives from the kitchen block was absent. This discovery immediately raised suspicions that the weapon used in the attack had come from inside the house, an important detail that indicated the crime was committed by someone familiar with the home. The missing knife was eventually found, but the circumstances surrounding its discovery were strange. Hours after the body was removed and the room had been cleared, officers found a steak knife that had been carefully washed and returned to the knife block in the kitchen. On the surface, it appeared clean, no blood, no stains. However, forensics testing would reveal otherwise. A detailed examination of the knife revealed trace amounts of blood along the edge of the blade, as well as minute traces between the handle and the blade, an area where blood tends to be particularly difficult to remove. Forensic experts emphasized that even small amounts of blood, especially when tested in a lab, are impossible to overlook. These findings suggested the knife had indeed been used in the attack and then carefully wiped clean, an attempt to erase evidence that would later prove to be one of the most damning pieces of the puzzle. Further forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed other, more unsettling findings. As the team continued to document the evidence, they noticed something peculiar in the corner of the room. Blood had been carefully wiped from the floor and surrounding areas, but there were telltale signs of tampering. It wasn't just the wiped floor that raised suspicion, it was the presence of fresh cleaning marks, the kind made by someone trying to obscure or eliminate blood stains. Whoever had cleaned the scene had been thorough, perhaps too thorough. Curiously, when investigators removed some of the floorboards in the bedroom and the trim along the edges of the room, they found what appeared to be hidden traces of blood that had not been cleaned. The blood was deeply embedded beneath the floorboards, far from the area that had been scrubbed earlier. This was significant. It pointed to an intentional effort to stage the scene, to make the crime look less violent than it truly was. Forensic experts were able to confirm that the stains found under the floorboards matched the blood type of Robert Hoofer. This discovery was crucial. It further indicated that someone had not only attempted to clean the scene but had done so in a manner that would mislead investigators into thinking the crime had been far less bloody than it had actually been. In addition to the blood stains beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered what seemed to be small attempts at staging the scene. A decorative rug in the room had been moved, and there were other oddities that suggested someone had tried to manipulate the room's appearance to make it seem like a more ordinary, less violent death. The lack of forced entry was still a glaring piece of the puzzle. With no signs of struggle, no forced doors or windows, and no signs that anything had been taken from the home, investigators quickly surmised that this was a case of someone close to Robert, someone who had the opportunity to commit such a crime without raising suspicion. The staged scene, the missing knife, the cleaned knife, and the traces of blood hidden under the floorboards all painted a picture of calculated behavior. Whoever was responsible for Robert Hoofer's death knew what they were doing. This was no random crime of passion. This was someone who thought ahead, someone who believed they could cover their tracks. As forensic experts worked tirelessly to analyze the evidence, the detectives began to focus their attention on the one person who had been with Robert that night, Heather Hoofer. Her actions, her behavior during and after the murder, and the evidence of her attempts to clean the crime scene would become central to the investigation. Every decision she made following her husband's death, every seemingly insignificant action, was now being scrutinized for hidden meaning. The crime scene was no longer just the place where Robert had died. It had become a puzzle, a series of clues and contradictions, each leading investigators closer to the truth. From the very beginning of the investigation, Heather's story appeared disjointed, with key elements that didn't quite fit the evidence or align with what investigators would expect from someone who had just found their spouse dead in such a violent manner. Heather's 911 call, while emotional, raised red flags for experienced law enforcement officials. The lack of urgency, the almost detached tone, and the fact that she refused to attempt CPR on her supposedly lifeless husband set the stage for an investigation that would soon reveal many discrepancies in her account of the events. At first, Heather told the dispatch operator that she had woken up to find Robert lying motionless on the floor beside their bed. Her story suggested that she discovered Robert, but she was unable to explain how or why he was on the floor in the first place. This was the first inconsistency. If Robert had been lying on the floor, lifeless, why was there no sign of a struggle? And why would he have been positioned in such a way if he had been attacked while lying in bed? As detectives analyzed the forensic evidence, their suspicions grew. The blood patterns surrounding Robert's body indicated that he had bled out over a period of time, which contradicted Heather's claim that she had discovered him already dead. The blood spatter analysis suggested that Robert had been bleeding before he fell to the floor, and the position of his body and the wounds indicated that he likely hadn't died instantly. This would have given Heather a significant amount of time to react to the situation, yet she claimed to have found him already gone. The forensic evidence indicated that Robert had suffered from a violent, prolonged death, a detail that seemed to go unnoticed or ignored by Heather in her initial statements. Adding to the growing doubts about her account was Heather's refusal to perform CPR during the 911 call. In cases like this, it is common for people to panic and try to administer CPR in a desperate attempt to save a loved one, even if they are unsure of how to do it correctly. But Heather's response was not that of someone in shock or frantic over the possibility of losing her husband. When the dispatcher instructed her to begin CPR, Heather declined, explaining that she believed Robert was already beyond saving. The calmness in her voice was chilling. She didn't sound like someone who had just found her spouse dead. In fact, her demeanor was oddly composed, almost as though she were trying to manage a situation she had already mentally accepted. This lack of panic only fueled the investigators' growing suspicion. When Heather was questioned by detectives, her calm demeanor remained. She did not seem to exhibit the grief or distress one would expect from someone who had just lost their spouse in such a violent manner. In fact, at one point during an interview, Heather reportedly laughed, an act so incongruent with the gravity of the situation that it unnerved the investigators. For seasoned detectives, this behavior was deeply concerning. The laughter seemed almost like a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the uncomfortable reality of what was happening. It raised immediate questions. Why would someone laugh in such a serious situation? Could it be an indication of guilt or an attempt to mask the true nature of her emotions? This incongruous behavior didn't go unnoticed. Investigators noted that Heather's calmness in the face of tragedy seemed to contradict the frantic reaction expected from someone who had just found their spouse dead under such suspicious circumstances. Her demeanor was too detached, almost like she was trying too hard to seem unaffected. When combined with the inconsistencies in her initial story and the refusal to attempt CPR, her behavior raised serious doubts about her version of events. As the investigation deepened, Heather's suggestion that Robert may have harmed himself became another key point of contention. She told detectives that Robert had been under immense stress, and she implied that he may have been suicidal. However, the forensic evidence painted a very different picture. The deep, deliberate nature of the stab wound, combined with the lack of defensive wounds or any signs that Robert had attempted to prevent the attack, made suicide highly unlikely. Forensic experts pointed out that the wound was consistent with a murder, not a self-inflicted injury. The location and depth of the stab wound suggested that someone had attacked Robert with the intent to kill him, rather than Robert having done this to himself. Further complicating Heather's suggestion of suicide was the nature of the weapon used. The knife that had been recovered from the couple's kitchen, though cleaned, was the type of weapon typically associated with a violent attack rather than a self-inflicted wound. It was sharp and long, designed to cause fatal injury with a single strike. Again, not a typical choice for someone trying to take their own life. Additionally, Heather's attempt to cast doubt on the situation by raising the possibility of Robert's suicide seemed out of place. At no point during her initial statement or her interactions with investigators did she display the appropriate level of concern or grief for the man she was now implying might have taken his own life. Instead of focusing on her loss or the horrific discovery of her husband's body, she instead fixated on the idea that Robert might have been in a state of deep emotional turmoil. This shift in focus was troubling to investigators, who began to view it as an attempt to deflect attention away from the possibility of foul play and toward an explanation that was both improbable and unsupported by the evidence. Detectives also found it odd that Heather, in the immediate aftermath of Robert's death, was more concerned with explaining away the situation than genuinely mourning or investigating what had happened. This behavior, combined with her conflicting statements, left investigators questioning whether Heather's story was a carefully crafted narrative designed to mask her involvement in the crime. As the investigation progressed, Heather's inconsistencies only continued to mount. Her timeline of events, her behavior, and her shifting explanations all added up to a portrait of someone who was not being entirely truthful with authorities. And with each new detail uncovered, the more Heather's version of events seemed to unravel, leaving a growing suspicion that she knew far more about her husband's death than she was willing to admit. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Heather Hoofer's actions in the days, months, and years following Robert's death was how seamlessly she returned to her everyday life. In the immediate aftermath of Robert's tragic and violent death, most would expect a grieving widow to exhibit signs of sorrow, guilt, or distress, particularly given the circumstances surrounding his passing. Yet, Heather's behavior after the murder was anything but typical of someone grappling with the sudden loss of a spouse. Just days after finding Robert's body, Heather returned to her job as a third-grade teacher. She resumed her role in the classroom with apparent ease, continuing to guide young children with the same dedication and enthusiasm she had before. To her colleagues, students, and parents, Heather seemed like nothing more than a devoted educator who had suffered a great personal loss but was managing to carry on with her responsibilities. There were no outward signs of the emotional turmoil one might expect from a woman who had just been through such a traumatic event. In fact, for the next 5 years, Heather's life appeared to be moving forward as if nothing had changed. She posted cheerful updates on social media, sharing photos of herself smiling, traveling, and participating in various social activities. The online persona she cultivated was one of a woman who had weathered a difficult storm but was now back to living her best life. Friends and acquaintances who interacted with Heather on a daily basis were none the wiser about the dark secret she was hiding. She maintained her role as a beloved teacher, planning lessons, attending parent-teacher conferences, and participating in school events as if nothing had ever happened. But behind the facade of normalcy, there were clues that suggested Heather's life had not been as unaffected as it appeared. Detective work continued behind the scenes as law enforcement quietly gathered evidence, piecing together the inconsistencies in Heather's story. Forensic analysis, witness testimonies, and phone records were reviewed, all of which painted a picture of a woman who had been hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. While Heather went about her life seemingly unbothered, detectives were tirelessly working to uncover the truth. They spoke to friends, family members, and colleagues, gathering insights into Heather's behavior and the events leading up to Robert's death. Despite the 5 years that had passed since the murder, the case was far from closed in the eyes of law enforcement. They were determined to find out what really happened on that fateful November morning. Among the people detectives spoke with were Heather's closest friends. They described a woman who had appeared outwardly composed, yet there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. Several people recalled that Heather had a tendency to downplay the severity of her grief, particularly when discussing Robert's death. Friends mentioned that she seemed to move on very quickly, as though she was anxious to return to a normal routine. Some were taken aback by how little she spoke about her late husband in the years that followed. It was as though his death had become an afterthought, with Heather rarely acknowledging it outside of the occasional passing comment. Despite this, there were others who observed that Heather seemed to take every opportunity to portray herself as a victim. In the years following Robert's death, she frequently shared social media posts that emphasized her struggles as a widow. She portrayed herself as a woman who had endured an immense loss but was bravely pushing forward with her life. Yet, as investigators continued to dig deeper, they began to see this public persona in a new light. Perhaps it was less about honoring Robert's memory and more about building a narrative that cast her as the grieving widow who had been unfairly thrust into the role of a victim. Meanwhile, Heather's behavior in her professional life was equally telling. She continued to be praised by parents and colleagues for her dedication and enthusiasm in the classroom. As a third-grade teacher, Heather was well-liked and respected, with many describing her as an engaging and caring educator. She was known for organizing field trips, participating in school events, and always putting the needs of her students first. But as the years passed, some parents began to notice subtle changes in Heather's demeanor. A few questioned whether someone who had experienced such a traumatic event could truly be this unaffected by it. Still, none suspected the dark truth that lay beneath the surface. It was also notable that during these 5 years, Heather continued to maintain a carefully curated social media presence. Her Facebook posts, Instagram photos, and other online content gave the impression of a woman living a fulfilling life despite the tragic circumstances of her past. She posted pictures from vacations, social gatherings, and family celebrations, all while showing little sign of mourning for her husband. There were no emotional tributes to Robert, no moments of raw grief or reflection on her loss. It was as though she had made a deliberate decision to move forward in a way that many found unsettling, by crafting a persona that was as far removed from the reality of her husband's death as possible. As Heather's life unfolded in the public eye, few outside her immediate circle knew the extent of the investigation that was still ongoing behind closed doors. It wasn't until years later that the community of Farmington would learn the shocking truth. Heather had been a suspect in Robert's murder all along, and investigators had continued to build their case against her over the course of 5 long years. The revelation that Heather had been teaching in a local school while being an active suspect in a murder investigation stunned many. How could a woman accused of such a violent crime have maintained her job as an educator? School officials later admitted they were unaware of the ongoing investigation at the time and expressed their shock upon learning of Heather's arrest. Some parents felt betrayed, realizing that the woman who had taught their children for years had been hiding such a dark secret. For the residents of Farmington, the arrest of Heather Hoofer in 2025 was a wake-up call, a reminder that the most domestic murders are notoriously difficult to prosecute, often lacking the crucial elements of motive, witness testimony, or clear-cut evidence. In the case of Robert Hoofer's death, investigators faced a complex puzzle that seemed, at first, to defy easy resolution. The only direct witness to the crime was Heather herself, and her conflicting statements and emotional detachment raised immediate red flags. Yet, without clear forensic evidence pointing directly to her guilt, it would take time, patience, and an unwavering commitment to uncover the truth. Over the course of 5 years, detectives worked tirelessly to build a case against Heather Hoofer, using forensic evidence, digital data, and a detailed examination of her actions leading up to and following Robert's death. While Heather had returned to her life as a teacher, posting updates on social media and presenting herself as a grieving widow, law enforcement remained dedicated to the idea that she might have been hiding something far darker. What followed was a methodical investigation that slowly pieced together the true story behind Robert Hoofer's death. One of the first steps in building the case was to analyze Heather's timeline on the night of Robert's murder. She had claimed to have gone to bed early, and later discovered Robert's body the following morning. But investigators had their doubts. Using her phone records and other digital evidence, they were able to establish a more accurate timeline of Heather's activities on the night of November 9, 2020. Phone records revealed that Heather was active on her phone well after the time she claimed to have gone to bed. The data showed that she had made several calls and sent multiple text messages late into the night, activity that contradicted her statement that she had gone to sleep early. The phone records placed her awake at times she had insisted she was asleep, suggesting that she may have been awake when Robert was attacked. This discrepancy raised questions about her story, and the investigators began to suspect that Heather's account of the events might be deliberately misleading. Further investigation into Heather's phone activity revealed even more troubling information. Her search history included multiple queries related to cleaning up bloodstains and the amount of time it takes for a body to bleed out. These searches were deeply disturbing. They suggested that, in the moments after Robert's death, Heather may have been attempting to find ways to cover up her involvement in the crime. The fact that she had searched for such information at all painted a chilling picture of premeditation and a calculated effort to destroy or obscure evidence of the murder. These searches were not the only digital evidence that raised suspicions. Heather's social media activity also came under scrutiny. Investigators noted that Heather had continued to post cheerful and upbeat photos on Facebook shortly after Robert's death. Some of these posts were made within days of his passing, a stark contrast to the grieving widow she claimed to be. Her seemingly unfazed attitude on social media indicated a disturbing lack of emotional distress. This raised questions about her true feelings surrounding Robert's death. Was she genuinely grieving, or was she playing the role of a grieving widow to cover up her involvement? Alongside the digital evidence, investigators also looked into Heather and Robert's financial history. They discovered that, shortly before Robert's death, the couple had taken out a life insurance policy that would pay out a substantial sum in the event of his death. The policy named Heather as the sole beneficiary, and the payout was enough to significantly change her financial situation. While the mere existence of a life insurance policy did not prove Heather's involvement in Robert's death, it added another layer of suspicion. Why had the couple taken out the policy just months before his death, and what role did it play in Heather's actions that fateful night? The investigation turned to forensic analysis of the crime scene, which revealed crucial information that contradicted Heather's account of events. The blood spatter patterns and evidence of staged cleaning in the bedroom where Robert's body was discovered suggested that the crime scene had been tampered with. It became increasingly clear that Heather had attempted to cover her tracks by cleaning up the blood and other evidence of the crime. The discovery of the washed steak knife, which was later found to contain trace amounts of blood, pointed direct. On April 1, 2025, 5 long years after Robert Hoofer's tragic death, Heather Hoofer was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering. The date of her arrest carried with it a haunting symbolism, as it marked the anniversary of Robert's death. The small community of Farmington, New Mexico, had moved on with their lives, and most had long forgotten the quiet tragedy that had once unfolded in their midst. But for the detectives and prosecutors who had never stopped investigating, April 1st became the day that justice was finally set into motion. For 5 years, Heather had lived a seemingly normal life. She had returned to her job as a third-grade teacher, continued to post on social media, and had even maintained the appearance of a grieving widow. To many in Farmington, it was difficult to believe that the woman they had seen every day, teaching their children and interacting with the community, could have been capable of such a dark and violent act. Her arrest stunned not only the public but also those closest to her, including her colleagues and neighbors, many of whom had no idea that Heather was even a suspect in her husband's death. The arrest came after a lengthy and methodical investigation. Over the years, law enforcement had pieced together a disturbing picture of Heather's involvement in the crime, thanks to the mounting forensic evidence and inconsistencies in her statements. The arrest affidavit, filed by prosecutors, outlined in chilling detail the evidence that led to the decision to charge Heather with murder. The affidavit highlighted the forensic findings that had been critical in uncovering the truth. The most damning piece of evidence was the discovery of the blood-stained knife, which had been washed and placed back in the kitchen block in an attempt to conceal its role in the crime. Forensic testing had revealed trace amounts of Robert's blood on the blade, making it clear that the knife had been used to fatally stab him. Investigators had also uncovered the disturbing fact that Heather had attempted to clean up the crime scene, washing away bloodstains from the floor and surrounding areas. Despite her efforts, investigators had found more blood hidden under the floorboards and trim, suggesting that someone had tried to erase any trace of the violent act. Moreover, the affidavit detailed Heather's behavior following Robert's death. Her lack of urgency during the 911 call, her refusal to perform CPR, and her seemingly calm demeanor in the hours after the murder had raised suspicion from the very beginning. Investigators also noted her odd behavior during questioning, including moments where she laughed during her interview, behavior that was widely regarded as inappropriate given the circumstances. These inconsistencies in her story, combined with the forensic evidence, painted a clear picture of someone attempting to cover their tracks. Prosecutors, in their affidavit, argued that the crime was one of sudden and intense passion, aligning it with second-degree murder rather than premeditated first-degree murder. This distinction was important in the case, as second-degree murder carries a lesser penalty than first-degree murder. Prosecutors suggested that Heather's motive might have been rooted in an overwhelming, momentary burst of emotion, possibly fueled by her growing resentment toward Robert, compounded by the couple's financial difficulties and her discontent with their marriage. The fact that she had made the decision to end Robert's life in such a violent manner suggested a crime of passion, one that occurred in the heat of the moment, rather than the result of a long-planned scheme. The choice of second-degree murder over first-degree murder also indicated that prosecutors believed Heather's actions were not premeditated. The evidence suggested that, while she may have planned for some time to harm Robert, the act itself was driven by an impulsive decision rather than careful calculation. The suddenness of the attack, coupled with the absence of signs of premeditation, made second-degree murder a more fitting charge. For many, the arrest was a moment of unsettling realization. The woman who had taught their children, the woman who had shared the grief of a widow, was now facing charges that painted her in a very different light. The arrest also raised uncomfortable questions about the lengths to which someone could go to hide their true nature, to conceal their actions, and to present a facade of normalcy while harboring a dark secret. As the news of Heather's arrest spread, the community was divided. Some found it difficult to accept the possibility that a woman they had known for years could have been involved in such a horrific crime. Others, however, expressed feelings of betrayal and anger, particularly those who had trusted Heather to care for their children and believed in her role as an educator and caregiver. Some of her former colleagues, who had been in close contact with her after Robert's death, admitted they had always found her behavior unsettling. They recalled how Heather had seemed unaffected by Robert's death and how she had carried on with her life without showing the emotional distress one would expect from someone who had lost a spouse. In the wake of Heather's arrest, many of Robert's friends and family expressed their relief that the truth was finally coming to light. They had long suspected that something was amiss, and they were finally seeing justice take shape. However, the arrest also left them with questions about what had truly happened that night, about the motivations behind Heather's actions, and about how someone could seemingly live a double life for so many years without detection. Heather was taken into custody and held without bail as the legal proceedings moved forward. Her defense attorney, who had been retained to represent her, issued a statement expressing confidence that Heather would be acquitted, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that her actions in the aftermath of Robert's death were misinterpreted. The defense team was expected to present a case that focused on Heather's emotional state at the time of the murder and the possibility that she had been under immense stress, which might have clouded her judgment. The arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter in the case, one in which the community, the legal system, and the surviving family members would have to grapple with the truth of what had happened in that quiet bedroom on November 10, 2020. As the case moved toward trial, the questions surrounding Robert Hoofer's death only seemed to multiply. Was this a crime of passion? Did Heather act out of desperation, or was there a darker, more calculating motive behind her actions? The truth was finally coming to light, but it would be up to the courts to determine whether justice would truly be served. When the news of Heather Hoofer's arrest spread through the small town of Farmington, New Mexico, the community was thrown into shock and confusion. The reaction was swift and polarized, with people struggling to reconcile the image of Heather as the beloved teacher and grieving widow with the reality of her involvement in a violent crime. For many, the arrest shattered the image of the perfect, caring educator that Heather had so carefully cultivated over the years. For some members of the community, Heather's arrest was a complete shock. She had been well known and well liked, particularly by the parents of the young children she taught at the local elementary school. Heather had built a reputation as a compassionate, dedicated teacher, one who went above and beyond to support her students. Parents trusted her with their children, confident in her ability to nurture and educate the next generation. It's impossible to wrap my head around, one parent, who had known Heather for years, said. How could someone so kind, so involved in our kids' lives, be capable of something like this? It's like a nightmare. Parents whose children had been in Heather's class expressed a deep sense of betrayal. To them, the thought of a woman they had trusted implicitly being capable of such an act was nearly incomprehensible. The idea that someone they had invited into their homes and lives, who had spent hours with their children, could be hiding such a dark secret was terrifying. It's terrifying, one mother said, her voice shaking. To think someone capable of this could be standing in front of our children every day, it's beyond belief. The idea that Heather had been living a double life, one of a dedicated teacher by day and, allegedly, a cold-blooded murderer by night, was too much for many to accept. These parents were not just confronting the loss of Robert Hoofer but now had to reconcile the fact that someone they thought they knew and trusted could have been responsible for such an unimaginable act. For the teachers and staff at the elementary school where Heather had worked, the arrest triggered a wave of disbelief and confusion. Many had never suspected that something was wrong, but in hindsight, some began to recall instances of Heather's behavior that seemed odd in the days and weeks following Robert's death. I always thought she was just grieving, one colleague admitted. But looking back, she never seemed to show any real emotion, never really seemed to mourn like someone would after losing a spouse. It was as if she was just moving on, like nothing happened. Former colleagues expressed a mix of disbelief, concern, and, in some cases, even guilt. Many admitted that they had found Heather's demeanor unsettling after Robert's death. They recalled how, in the aftermath of the tragedy, she continued to post cheerful updates on social media, as if life were returning to normal for her. She had even posted photos from family trips, smiling in pictures with friends and colleagues, while never truly addressing the gravity of the situation. For some, it felt as if she was trying to live a normal life while hiding a secret too dark to comprehend. She was always so composed, even after everything happened. Too composed, one former colleague remarked. We were all concerned for her, of course, but we thought it was because she was grieving. Now, I can't help but wonder if she was more focused on hiding something. What shocked many the most was Heather's apparent lack of visible guilt. She had been the face of grief for so long. Her tragic loss of a husband had garnered sympathy from many in the town. But the arrest raised questions about whether Heather had ever truly been affected by her husband's death or whether she had merely been playing a role in front of those who had never suspected a thing. To some, it was as if Heather had been the ultimate actor, hiding her true self behind a mask of grief and normalcy for years. Teachers at the school where Heather had taught expressed mixed feelings about the woman they had once called a colleague. Some were simply stunned that she had been able to hide such a dark side, while others expressed regret that they had never noticed any warning signs. We were all so focused on her personal loss that we missed the red flags, one colleague admitted. But in hindsight, it's clear that she never showed real sadness, never really talked about Robert. It was all surface level. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. As word of Heather's arrest continued to spread, the reactions from the community grew more polarized. Some could not fathom that the woman who had been a constant presence in their children's lives was capable of such violence. They held on to the image of the smiling, caring teacher they had seen for years, refusing to believe that the woman they had trusted could be involved in something so horrific. Others, however, began to voice their doubts. Some longtime acquaintances and former friends admitted that they had always found Heather to be a bit aloof, even distant at times. While they hadn't suspected her of murder, they now questioned the authenticity of her grief and her behavior in the years following Robert's death. I've always had my doubts about Heather, one acquaintance confessed. She always seemed like she was hiding something. She was always very careful about what she shared, and that made me uncomfortable. Now I know why. The case also prompted a deep sense of unease in the town, particularly among those who had interacted with Heather on a regular basis. Heather's arrest revealed how even the most well-crafted facades can conceal terrifying truths. Many began to ask themselves how well they truly knew the people around them, especially those who had so carefully guarded their secrets. The thought that someone in their midst could harbor such dark impulses while maintaining a life of normalcy raised unsettling questions about the nature of deception and the lengths people would go to hide their true selves. While the community struggled to come to terms with Heather's arrest, there was a growing sense of fear and mistrust. Parents began to question whether they could ever truly know the people they entrusted with their children's safety. Teachers, in particular, found themselves grappling with a deeper sense of insecurity. If someone so close to their community could conceal such a dark secret, could others be doing the same? As the legal proceedings moved forward, the emotional impact of Heather's arrest would continue to reverberate throughout the community. The questions, the doubts, and the sense of betrayal would linger, leaving many in Farmington to wonder if they had truly known the woman who had lived among them all these years. Could they have prevented the tragedy, or had they been blind to the signs all along? As Heather Hoofer's arrest sent shockwaves through the community, the legal proceedings that would follow were sure to be just as contentious and high-profile as the case itself. After 5 years of investigation, her upcoming preliminary hearing was set for May 14, 2025, marking a crucial step in what would be a long and intense legal battle. With the case garnering national attention, the eyes of the public, media, and legal experts were on the courtrooms of Farmington, where the truth behind Robert Hoofer's tragic death would finally be examined in full. Prosecutors were poised to present what they hoped would be a compelling and airtight case against Heather. They had spent years meticulously gathering forensic evidence, piecing together a timeline of events, and analyzing inconsistencies in Heather's own statements and behavior. The evidence was overwhelming, according to investigators, and they were confident that it would paint a clear picture of Heather's involvement in her husband's death. From the bloodstains under the floorboards to the washed knife, forensic experts had demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert Hoofer had not simply died from an accidental injury but had been deliberately attacked. The murder weapon, a knife taken from the couple's own kitchen, had traces of Robert's blood on it, despite being cleaned. Investigators had also been able to connect Heather's behavior, her strange detachment during the 911 call and her refusal to perform CPR, to the forensic evidence that suggested a more complex and sinister series of events than she had initially described. Legal experts believed that the prosecution would build its case around this forensic evidence, highlighting the deliberate nature of Robert's death and Heather's actions in the hours and days that followed. However, they were also expecting the prosecution to focus on the financial motive. The recently discovered life insurance policy, which had been taken out shortly before Robert's death, would likely play a key role in the argument that Heather had something to gain from his death, a motive that might explain why she had acted in such a cold and calculating manner. While Heather's behavior in the aftermath of the murder had undoubtedly raised suspicions, it was the forensic evidence, the financial aspects of the case, and the inconsistencies in her statements that would form the backbone of the prosecution's argument. They were confident that, together, these factors would convince a jury that Heather Hoofer had not simply been a grieving widow, but a woman who had carefully staged a crime scene and attempted to conceal her actions in a bid to avoid suspicion. On the other hand, Heather's defense team had remained tight-lipped about the specifics of their strategy. However, legal analysts anticipated that they would argue that the evidence against her was circumstantial at best. The prosecution's case was based on a collection of facts: Heather's behavior, the blood evidence, and the financial motive, but none of these pieces could directly place Heather at the scene of the crime at the precise moment of Robert's death. The defense was likely to argue that Heather's actions, while peculiar, did not necessarily equate to guilt. The fact that she had not performed CPR, for example, could be explained by her emotional state, or even her belief that there was nothing that could be done at that point. Furthermore, they might argue that the life insurance policy was not evidence of premeditated murder but rather a standard financial arrangement that many married couples set up without any ill intentions. The defense would also have the difficult task of addressing Heather's apparent detachment after Robert's death. Her return to work just days after his passing, her continued social media presence, and her lack of visible grief were behaviors that the prosecution had seized on as evidence of her guilt. But the defense could counter that everyone grieves in their own way, and just because Heather did not show the same outward signs of mourning as others might expect, it did not mean she was guilty of murder. They may also argue that Heather's behavior in interviews and on the 911 call was not indicative of guilt but rather of someone in shock or even in denial, natural responses to the sudden and traumatic loss of a loved one. In the end, much of the case was likely to hinge on the forensic testimony and the psychological profile of Heather herself. Legal experts believed that her defense team would attempt to cast doubt on the idea that Heather had orchestrated the murder in cold blood. They might argue that she was not a calculating killer, but a woman who had become overwhelmed by financial and emotional strain and had made impulsive decisions that led to tragic consequences. Whether or not they could convince a jury that Heather was capable of such an extreme act of violence, and whether they could explain her strange behavior in the aftermath, would ultimately determine the outcome of the case. The public was also likely to see a high-profile trial, one that would captivate both local and national audiences. The media's coverage of Heather's arrest had already painted her as a grieving widow who had been hiding a dark secret, and now the trial would be a moment for both sides to present their narrative. With the prosecution pushing for a second-degree murder conviction and the defense working to undermine the case with reasonable doubt, there was little chance of a quick resolution. The trial was expected to be long and drawn out, filled with emotional testimony, conflicting expert opinions, and a battle for the jury's trust. Legal experts anticipated that the trial would be one of the most publicized in recent years, drawing attention not only for the shocking nature of the crime but also for the moral questions it raised about trust, deception, and the lengths people will go to hide their darkest secrets. Ultimately, Heather's fate would depend on how well the prosecution could prove that she had planned and carried out her husband's murder, and whether the defense could convince the jury that she had simply been a woman overwhelmed by the pressures of her life, reacting in ways that were far from criminal. As the preliminary hearing loomed, all eyes in the town of Farmington, and beyond, were on the courtroom, where the unraveling of this deeply disturbing case would continue. With both sides preparing for what was sure to be a fiercely contested trial, the question remained: would Heather Hoofer's story of grief and confusion hold up under the weight of the evidence, or would the true nature of her involvement in Robert Hoofer's death come to light? The legal road ahead for Heather Hoofer was paved with uncertainty, and as her trial date approached, it became clearer that justice, no matter how long it took, would eventually find its way to the surface. The story of Heather Hoofer is one that haunts, perplexes, and challenges our perception of the world around us. The case serves as a chilling reminder that, often, the face people show the world is nothing more than a mask, one that can hide the darkest of secrets. For 5 long years, Heather lived among her community in Farmington, New Mexico, her life seemingly unaffected by the tragedy she had been part of. She taught young children with dedication, posted cheerful updates on social media, and appeared to be the picture of a devoted widow mourning her husband's sudden and violent death. But behind the facade of the grieving wife, a different reality was taking shape, one that would only begin to emerge as investigators carefully peeled away the layers of deception. Heather's ability to maintain this persona for so long, continuing to live her life as if nothing had happened, only amplified the unsettling nature of the case. For years, she had been living with her secret, a secret that eventually unraveled under the pressure of persistent investigation and an unrelenting pursuit of the truth. With each new revelation, the walls of the carefully constructed narrative that Heather had built around herself started to crumble, exposing the lies, the inconsistencies, and the dark motives that had remained hidden for so long. The questions that lingered throughout the investigation were not only about Heather's role in her husband's death but also about the nature of the deception itself. How could someone so close, so seemingly normal, turn out to be capable of such a heinous act? How could a woman who had shown no visible signs of grief or remorse for her husband's death possibly be guilty of taking his life? For many in the community, the case represented the darkest kind of betrayal, one that shattered the illusion of safety and trust in their midst. But beyond the shock and disillusionment, the case also serves as a reminder of the lengths to which people will go to conceal their true selves. Heather's actions were carefully calculated, from the staged crime scene to the deliberate steps she took to cover up her involvement. The forensic evidence, her contradictory statements, and the discovery of the life insurance policy that would have benefited her all pointed toward a woman who, despite her outwardly perfect life, was hiding a deeper, darker truth. If Heather Hoofer is found guilty, she will likely face a sentence that could keep her behind bars for decades. The charges of second-degree murder and evidence tampering carry heavy consequences, and her actions will no doubt resonate throughout the legal system as a case of premeditated violence masked by the illusion of innocence. It's a sobering reality that reflects just how far someone might go when they believe they can get away with murder, or when the pressures of their personal life seem to push them toward a point of no return. Yet, beyond the verdict and the potential sentence lies a deeper, more unsettling question: how well do we truly know those closest to us? In the case of Heather Hoofer, the answer is more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Those who knew her, her friends, her family, and even her students, were left grappling with the realization that the person they thought they understood had been hiding something far more sinister beneath the surface. The tragedy of Robert Hoofer's death is not just the loss of a man taken too soon, but also the shattering of the trust and intimacy that so often binds people together. As for Robert's final moments, the truth of what really happened may never fully come to light. What happened in the bedroom that night, the events leading up to his death, will forever remain a mystery to those who weren't there. We may never fully understand what drove Heather to kill her husband or why she chose to cover up her crimes so thoroughly. But the absence of complete understanding does not diminish the gravity of the case or the painful reality of Robert's death. In the end, justice may not be about knowing every detail of the crime. It's about holding accountable those who choose to act with violence, who disrupt the lives of those who trust them most. As the case continues to unfold, one thing is certain: justice, no matter how delayed, has finally begun its course. The arrest and upcoming trial of Heather Hoofer represent a significant step toward closure for Robert's family and for the community that had been left to grapple with the aftermath of his death. While the investigation has been long and the road to justice has been slow, the truth has finally begun to break free from the shadows, and the answers that many had feared to seek are now coming into focus. For those who knew Robert, the pain of his loss will never fully go away. But in the pursuit of justice, there is hope that the truth will bring some measure of peace. As the courtroom drama unfolds and the pieces of the puzzle are fit together, one can only hope that this case will stand as a stark reminder. Appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the people we trust the most are capable of unspeakable acts. Whether or not Heather is ultimately convicted, the damage caused by her deception has already left an indelible mark on those who were closest to her, and on the wider community, who must now come to terms with the reality of what happened in the quiet corners of their town. The story of Robert Hoofer's death is far from over. But for now, it is a tragic tale of deceit, betrayal, and the long path to justice, reminding us all of the thin line that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary, and how quickly the truth can shatter the carefully constructed lives we build around us. Did you enjoy this video? If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Unsolved Mystery Secrets. We dive deep into cases like these, and there's always more to uncover. Stay tuned for more chilling stories, and thank you for being part of our mystery-solving journey.